I'm Patrick Byers, retired Horticulture Field Specialist and Produce Food Safety Specialist with University of Missouri Extension. Thank you for joining us for this series of videos on-farm produce food safety. In this video, we're going to discuss managing risks that are present during the crop planting period and while growing crops. There are a number of strategies that farmers can practice to reduce risks during crop production. A pre-plant site inspection can be very helpful. The proper use of manures and composts can be an important risk management tool. Considering carefully irrigation strategies is important. Specific production practices such as training, trellising, and fencing can be helpful. And then a focus on the people working on the farm in the areas of health, hygiene, and safety is very important. A pre-plant site inspection can be very helpful from the standpoint of identifying risks before crops even go into the ground. First of all, look for evidence of animal issues, perhaps neighboring livestock activity, perhaps cover for animals such as deer, perhaps direct evidence of animals such as tracks. Also look at the farm and see if there are any areas that might be prone to flooding. And finally, take a close look at what's going on around the farm. Are there neighboring land activities that might present a risk? Compost and manure are assets on the farm, valuable sources of nutrients and a great way to divert a waste stream to a useful purpose. But we must remember that manure in particular carries risk because it contains the pathogens that can make people sick. Now, manure that has been through a scientifically validated composting process is safe. The heat that is generated eliminates those pathogens. When we think about using compost and manures, in the case of manure, it's a good practice to allow 120 days from the application of manure to a bed before a crop is harvested from that bed. If the compost is safe, it can be used up almost until the day of harvest. Irrigation is a necessary part of growing crops, but it's important to recognize that the water used in irrigation can pose a risk. First of all, it's important to understand the quality of that water. Is the water from a tested source, such as a municipal source? Is the water from a well that has been tested to make sure it's clean? Or is it surface water, which always carries some level of contamination? Only testing can tell. Secondly, how is the water being applied? An approach that keeps the water off of the part of the crop that is going to be harvested is going to be safer. In many cases, for example, drip or trickle irrigation is safer than an overhead irrigation where the entire plant is wetted. And finally, how close to harvest is the irrigation water being applied? The closer to harvest, the more important it is that that water be clean. So let's think about actual production practices and managing risks. So any way that we can manage contact of produce with soil, manure, or water can be a risk management strategy. As we discussed, drip or trickle irrigation can be very helpful. The use of mulches, either plastic or organic mulches, can reduce contact of produce with the soil. That's helpful as well. Trellising or fencing can be very helpful to keep produce up off the ground and farther away from contamination. Don't harvest produce that is dropped to the ground. Dropped produce frequently is damaged and contamination can actually become internalized in that situation. Hands contact produce, and we must recognize the people can be a source of contamination. First of all, health. Workers who are ill should not be working with produce. Secondly, injuries. Obviously, the first step in an injury situation is to address the injury, but also it's important to address any risk of contamination of produce from that injury. And finally, hygiene. Workers should always have access to clean, well-stocked toilet facilities and hand washing facilities, and they should be encouraged to use these properly. In conclusion, there are many things that farmers can do to minimize the risk of contamination during crop production. A pre-plant site inspection, very helpful. A focus on the use of manures and composts. Irrigation strategies that minimize contamination. Production practices that keep crops from becoming contaminated. And finally, a focus on the people working on the farm, particularly in the areas of health, hygiene, and injury management can be very helpful. I'm Patrick Byers, retired Horticulture Field Specialist and Produce Food Safety Specialist with University of Missouri Extension.